You are listening to Missed Apex Podcast. We live F1.
Welcome to Missed Apex Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Trumpets, and today we will be talking all things tech. So coming up, we'll discuss that there's still a lot to play for in the final races of the season from a technical point of view, why the FIA is being called on to referee toddler-level technical disputes, and we're going to gaze into our crystal ball at the upcoming regulations. But first, a reminder. We are an independent podcast produced in the podcasting shed with the kind support of our patrons and partners. We aim to bring you a race review before your Monday morning commute. We might be wrong, but we're first. And today we are joined by none other than that titan of Tech F1 and technical editor at motorsport.com, Matthew Somerfield, aka Summers F1. How's it going, Summers?
Very, very good. And it's been a long time coming again for a tech episode. So glad to be here, Matt.
Yes, I'm glad we could pry you away from your busy schedule for a few brief minutes to catch up with everything that's been going on, because it has been quite a season.
It has. There's been a lot of technical intrigue, a lot of back and forth between the teams, the governing body, Formula One itself. It's been a very interesting season from a tech standpoint.
It has been. So I want to do something unusual, because normally I like to start by, warming us up with the tires or discussing some floor edges. But today we have an amazing story that just broke over the week, where Red Bull essentially accused nameless other teams, possibly more than one, of doing something I'd never heard of before, which is intentionally putting water inside of the tires, not the outside of the tires, but inside of the tires to improve performance. And I gotta say, if you think about the physics of it a little bit, it kind of makes some level of sense, because evaporation would reduce casing temperature. But come on, really?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we're at a point in the season where there's been a lot of tit for tat in terms of technical stuff, where teams are sort of running off to the FIA at every moment they can possibly find to try to stymie their rivals. In this particular instance, the one thing that really is interesting is the fact that Red Bull have admitted that they've done it themselves in the past, and that the regulations, or should I say a technical directive, was issued to try and cover this particular aspect. So we're looking at something that Red Bull have done, and the people that worked at Red Bull that may now work for other teams might have that inside track on. And I believe that's realistically where we're seeing perhaps Red Bull thinking, hang on a minute, these people know what we've done in the past. Are they now applying it at their new team? I mean, let's be honest, it's not a nameless outfit, is it? We all know that this was directed towards McLaren, and because of the way in which they will operate their tyres during the course of a race, they feel that Red Bull, should I say, feel that perhaps McLaren have gained an advantage in that respect, and they're still struggling to understand it. And this is perhaps where the push between what is happening in reality versus what is happening from a political aspect, because they're almost downgrading McLaren's achievements in some respects as well. That to me is the way that it looks. They're degrading the way that McLaren's advantages has played out over the course of the season by keep making these accusations against them. And I think there's also, if you think about the cost cap and resource restriction side of things, in the past, Formula One teams could spend whatever they wanted, and they would. And if this sort of scenario happened, they'd probably go off and try and do it themselves rather than tittle-tattle to the FIA so that they gained an advantage and try to get an advantage over what their opposition were doing. So I think this is partly to do with the mechanism of how the cost cap, etc., works as well now. So it's very interesting from this modern standpoint to see how things now work compared to how they did historically as well.
Yeah, and if nothing else, I'm not surprised to hear you bring up the name McLaren, because that would be the main team that I suppose Red Bull would be concerned with. But even if they're not, it would seem like just the sheer bureaucracy of having to deal with that becomes a bit of a drag on the team. But tell me, how is Red Bull, like, what are they going to go to the FIA with, if you know? Like, what sort of evidence would you go to the FIA with and say, this is exactly why we think they're doing this illegal thing that we figured out how to do, but we swear left, right, up and down, we're not doing ourselves?
Yeah, so by all accounts, it was caught out in Singapore when the tyres were removed from the rims. We've all seen those pictures of when the Pirelli engineers are taking the tyres off after an event has taken place, and essentially it looked, according to Red Bull, that there was some water or liquid left over within the rim itself. So that is predominantly the reason or the story that has led us into this direction. Whether there was previous instances of that happening as well to back that up, I'm unsure if that's the case. It does make sense, as you mentioned earlier, from a physics point of view, that this is a possibility to actually gain an advantage. It's not something that is a wild conspiracy theory in any way. You could use it as a way of gaining an advantage, but it also comes with a bit of a double-edged sword, because in reality, I would imagine what the teams are doing, if they did want to introduce a liquid into the air, then you would end up in a situation where you'd raise the humidity inside the tyre, which would alter the bulk temperature, reducing the bulk temperature to make that more manageable. However, you have to have some reaction to that, and that would mean the pressure would go up. And we all know, with a minimum tyre pressure, all the teams want to run at a minimum tyre pressure. So by elevating that tyre pressure, you suddenly higher than you would ordinarily be. So there's sort of a give and take, you would imagine, if it had been happening. Let's just imagine that somebody was doing this particular trick. There'd have to be some give and take, and there would be some advantages and disadvantages to doing such a thing. One of those would be, if you are having higher pressure, you are also making the tyre stiffer. So you are essentially then adjusting ride height sensitivity. So, like I say, there's a play here as to whether it's an advantage or a disadvantage, and by how much you're introducing as vapour to the system, as to how it would work. And that's only something you can do via experience over a period of time as well. You're not just suddenly going to know how to do that, because, as we know, the tyres are only available at a race weekend. And so this is something that would have to develop over time into something that become more of a performance advantage that you'd gain over time, not just instantly, as I think perhaps that's what people might assume has happened here, is it's an instant advantage, and I don't think it would be that case.
Yeah, well, one of the numbers I saw when reading about this online was that apparently as little as a millimeter of water would be enough to make a big difference. So that might explain why. But now I'm thinking, but they do publish those linear curves of temperature pressure, and I wonder, like, how much would that throw that off to be discernible or not? I haven't heard that the FIA has seen anything.
Okay,
but,
so
yeah,
there were some quotes from Mario Asola from Pirelli in regards to this afterwards, and they're not looking for this sort of thing in reality. They're looking for the safety mechanisms that are involved in operating their tyres. And they're happy with what they've seen from their side of things, that they don't believe that anything has been tampered with in order to make the tyre unsafe. However, they're not saying that, there's something else going on in the background, but they haven't seen anything and they're not aware of it. They are now aware of it. They've worked with and alongside the FIA from Brazil onwards. There was a higher level of inspection done at Brazil from the sprint race, whereby, it was all done in front of an FIA delegate and, trying to almost catch the team out, I guess, or teams, should I say. Whether, like I say, this is one of those scenarios where we will never actually know. We will never know if it was done until somebody writes a book many years down the line. The other interesting thing, I think, from a mechanism point of view that perhaps people don't quite understand, is that The tyres are put on the rims and delivered back to the teams with the pressure, the stated pressure from Pirelli, and they use a dry air system. So they dry the air out and obviously deliver it with a dry air. However, past that point, it's down to the team to, if they want to, increase those minimum tyre pressures beyond what are the minimums. And the teams will do that because it's a setup element. Especially when we're talking about wet and inter tyres, because perhaps you want them to bite quicker, so you use less contact patch, so you'll overinflate them beyond the minimums to be able to create less contact patch and work the tyre quicker. There's, as I say, there's a huge amount of variables going on in the background, and like I say, I don't think we'll ever really truly know what has gone on. But what we do know is that Red Bull think something's gone on because they've had a car that they feel has lost performance over a window, and other teams have made gains.
Right. So it's very convenient for them when explaining things to the shareholders to point out that other teams were probably cheating, and that's why they looked worse.
Yeah, I mean, as we know, Red Bull have had numerous problems this season in terms of understanding where their car performance has left them by, and other teams have obviously gone beyond them to increase their performance, namely McLaren. We have seen Ferrari vault past them at points, and also Mercedes. So there's obviously going to be concern that, is it our development that's caused this problem, or is it external factors that we're not in control of? And I think that's where Red Bull are trying to point some fingers to say, that there may be some external factors, not just ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm looking back at the season, I think we're going to go backwards through all of these accusations. I think the majority of them originated from Red Bull, which, given their history, some people might find, the word rich springs to mind.
Yeah, I mean, but at the end of the day, this is what we have with Formula One right now. As I mentioned, I think in the past, perhaps Red Bull would have been keen to take advantage of those situations themselves, knowing the fact that they would be able to improve their own performance, perhaps beyond the envelope of the teams that they are suspecting foul play of. But now we're in a situation where budget and resources restrained. Their easier route is to be political with it and have the rival pegged back towards them, and whatever advantage they've got eroded, and I think that does play a significant role here.
Yeah, so it's much cheaper to have the FAA do your dirty work for you and bring your rival down, rather than to spend your own money working out how to do this without being caught, and all the testing and stuff that would have to go into engineering it properly. Although it sounds like they sort of already possess that knowledge, and then just, this may be me finally having more than two brain cells operative. But it seems like to me that if they possess that knowledge and they're not doing it, they're probably not doing it for a fairly good reason. One of which might be it's hard to do well, and the other of which is it's really easy to get caught. And so if that's the case for them, that would also be the case for every team.
Yeah, I also think that we have a bit of an issue here in terms of the difference between what is known as a technical directive and a regulation. So the regulations are binding. Technical directives are not. They are an interpretation that the FIA give to the teams, how they interpret their own regulations. However, if a team was to protest somebody else based upon their thinking of the regulations, the technical directive at that point doesn't mean anything, because the stewards can only realistically go off the regulations. And it's why we often see through the course of a season, and obviously at the end of a season, lots of changes made to the draft of the regulations in order to cut those things out of play and make them so they are legally binding within the regulations. And so the stewards can actually then determine who is legal from those set of instructions. So this is the problem with technical directives overlaying the regulation set. And in the regulations, it doesn't actually say that you can't increase you can't add vapor to the system technically. It talks about air, nitrogen, but air is not defined. we talk about altitude, for argument's sake, could have an impact there. And we go to circuits like Mexico, Brazil, they're at a high altitude and will have an impact in some respects to that. So there's a lot of variables here. I think, again, what we will see is something will be changed in the regulations to prohibit this going into 2025.
Okay, that is fascinating. And again, it's funny to me. Like we are talking about the technical regulations, and for years we've complained about not having technical directives available unless a team decides they want you to know about it, usually for a very self-involved reason, which fair enough. I'd rather get the information than not. But it does get down to that same frustration that you just like to know the rules everyone's playing by clearly, and they don't allow you access to that. And it's boiled over now to these driver guidelines where, you may have looked up from all your high definition pictures of aerodynamic bits and baubles to notice that there was a great deal of consternation as people were arguing from guidelines, and then journals are like, oh yeah, well no, they actually have different ones now, but nobody knows about them yet. I wish the sport would get its act together.
Yeah, I think what we have to remember here is that we're dealing with a set of regulations that have been constructed and then amended over time, and the technical directives, that are in play might not necessarily be accurate for this particular set of regulations. Let's say there's historic regulation sets whereby teams have done X, Y, or Z, and those technical directives are accurate for those, but they're not accurate completely for the prevailing regulations. And I think that's the case here with this thing that Red Bull have brought to town, is that when they assumed that this was banned, it now perhaps isn't banned under the prevailing regulations, because the way that the wording in the regulations is written is isn't in conjunction with how the technical directive is written. And then you obviously have the layer on top that a technical directive is not legally binding. So we've had this argument before by Red Bull that a technical directive is not a legal binding aspect of the sport, and now it seems that they believe it might be. So, we have to think about how we move going forward in terms of technical directives having an impact on the regs.
Heads I win, tails you lose. I like to play that game when it's my game.
Yes, exactly.
So let's talk about another one that is really, I think people has sort of forgotten about. But it brings us into our favorite fancy word, which is aeroelasticity. Now, Red Bull, I think it was Red Bull, correct me if I'm wrong, also had a big complaint about McLaren's rear wing, accused them of running essentially a mini DRS. So that actually was something they agreed to change. So clearly they were on or over whatever undefined limit the FIA has for that. But break that down for us a little bit. What was going on there? And do you agree with the judgment that they were well, I can't use the expression. They were going a bit far with it.
Okay. You're only going as far as if you get caught. We've had this discussion before. It's only illegal if it's illegal, and if you get caught with it being illegal. I think that exists in life itself and also in Formula One. However, I had a moment of huge what the hell whilst I was on board with Oscar Piastri looking back from his rear wing at Baku. And I did post about it on Twitter at the time. I refused to call it the other name, and posted a picture of what I'd seen, because I couldn't believe that we were in a position whereby I could see what was happening. Essentially, the front corners of the upper flap, the movable flap, the DRS flap, as most people would know it as, was starting to bend upwards in the corners when it was at high speed, which effectively means that the slot gap size is changing, and that means that it alters the dynamic effect of the rear wing itself, changes the downforce level, changes the drag level. So effectively what we're saying is that they were creating a mini DRS. Now, I didn't call it that. Others did afterwards, and it's the name that's been attributed to it. I don't know if I was the first to see it. I certainly was on Twitter, but I don't know if I was the first to see it out there in the world. However, I'm sure I'm probably not on McLaren's Christmas card list afterwards because of the chance that it got it banned thereafter. However, I think we also should look at the timeline of events that occurred thereafter, because I find that interesting as well, in as much as that the FIA did come out and say to McLaren, this is acceptable. And then at that point, all of the other teams came around and said, hang on a minute, how can this be acceptable? Because it's infringing certain regulations, certain things that we're not happy with. And they're not happy with it, obviously, because they don't have it, and it would take them time to get that same thing on their car. At which point, McLaren admitted that it was probably a little bit borderline and that they were going to change the specification of that wing by the time they got round to the next time it would be used, which I believe was supposed to be Las Vegas. We might have seen it ahead of that because of what I've seen since. However, that was, the story that was being spun at the time. And then obviously the FIA said, well, okay, let's say it's not kosher because you're saying it's not kosher, and we'll go down the line that it is now banned and nobody else can then run development to try to get a similar sort of scenario unfolding on their own. So I think, there is some more political aspect to this, again, a bit like the discussion we've just had about the tyres, in terms of being, is it legal, isn't it legal, who's making the decision it's legal and not legal, is it a regulation, is it just a piece of paper on a technical directive that nobody's ever seen, and how do we manage this going forward? Now, the FIA have also put in place extra tests regarding the rear wing post this going on. So if you remember back to Baku, I think it was in 2021, we had the dots added to the rear wing, and there was more. It's something that can't be used to say a rear wing is illegal, but it is something that the FIA can use as a method to say, hang on a minute, what's going on? So they use the high-res camera looking back at the rear wing, and they use the dots on the rear wing to see how much movement is going on with the rear wing. Now, those dots have been increased in their number, and the resolution of the camera looking at them has been increased as well since. So, yes, we're in a situation where something's now been banned, but we're also in a situation where we now got a mechanism to try to police things better as well. And again, it just comes down to the teams have more resources than the FIA do. So they're always going to win. It's just by how much.
Well, yeah, and I'm just laughing to myself here because I'm remembering the sudden rash of DRS elements blowing wide open on high-speed straights. That was such an entertainment. It was Ferrari and Red Bull particularly come to mind. Red Bull having, was it the medium downforce or the low down? I can't remember. One of their wings was just intensely problematic for them on that level. So it doesn't surprise me because once you have that knowledge, you're always going to seek to exploit it. But I'm surprised McLaren just rolled over and played dead as far as their defense went. So I have a multi-part question for you, my first one of the evening, as far as I can tell.
Drink.
And the first of which is, do you suppose it's because the fastest races, more or less, of the entire year had already occurred, so there was no point in arguing? And the second is, did you ever bother to go back and look at previous races and figure out how long they'd been pulling this particular trick?
The answer to the first question is, I can't remember the first part of the question, but I do remember the fact that I did go back and check how much they'd been using this particular feature, let's call it, because that's what it is. And I believe it was a few races. It wasn't just Baku that this was being used at. It was the thing that I think people perhaps want to understand better is that teams design or tend to design or have under this particular regulation set designed what we call families of wings. So they have very similar design characteristics, but they are changed based on the level of downforce that each team is generating from them. So that'd be downforce versus drag. And so McLaren have tended to have sort of 3 or 4 wings within a family of wings. You have a low, a medium to high, and a high downforce version of that particular design. And then you change the characteristics to suit those downforce levels. So it might not have even been their lowest downforce wing that had this particular feature. All of that family may well have done. However, also on top of that, which I think, again, people aren't perhaps aware of, is how much that the rear wing and beam wing and diffuser talk to one another from an aerodynamic point of view. And so you can tune them all together to create a sort of totality in what they're actually doing. Now, McLaren, let's just sidestep backwards a little bit and have a discussion about how their development has gone compared to everybody else when it comes to wings.
We need to get you a whiteboard for this, I can tell, even though we're an audio program. But go ahead.
7 rear wing designs they've had this season, on top of the one that they had in Bahrain. So that makes 8. 11 beam wing configurations. So they have been massively pushing development on that side of the car because they know that they can make an advantage there. But as I say, because they are families of wings, some of those wings are technically redundant at this point. You know, that they might have started out with a high, medium and low downforce that they'll never use again because they're from the first family of wings, and now they have a better configuration with the second family of wings. So their development, though, on that side of things, I think far outweighs any of the other teams on the grid, which makes you question about, you know, their development direction and their understanding of how to get the best from these regulations. Because in reality, that's more of an old school trick that we used to see, whereas we hadn't sort of seen that through this regulation set at this point. Only Red Bull had done it in the early phases, and they'd really done it only through beam wings rather than the rear wings as well. So interesting one that. We'll see how that pans out going forward into next year.
Well, the thing that the question was, had they gotten the best out of it because they were at the 2 fastest, Monza and Baku. And they basically said, yeah, we'll give up our advantage after. It doesn't make as much of a difference. But you've sparked about a million other thoughts in my head, unfortunately for our audience. And I'm going to try and work them as quickly as possible. But the families of wings, and it's particularly the rear, when you talk about them working together, I had understood, and I would use Red Bull here as an excellent example, that for what I would call local tuning of the combination of all of those, the beam wing had been where most teams were making adjustments, going from 1 or 2 elements and exactly how they were designed to sort of aid. Because what that's doing, if I understand it correctly, essentially what you're aiding is dragging air through and out of the diffuser. The more you can force the diffuser to deliver air to you at the back, the better the diffuser works at any given speed. It's going to be more efficient and provide you with more downforce to work with. But what you're telling me is it's not just the beam wing for McLaren, but it's the entire rear wing as well, and the combination of them.
Yeah, they've just been more expansive in their delivery of additional downforce drag configurations available to them to tune what they're actually looking for at each particular circuit. As I say, that had become more of a rarity under these regulations, I think primarily due to cost and resource restrictions. But McLaren have found, that they're obviously gaining an advantage by having more availability to them for a given circuit configuration. At the end of the day, it's all down to how you set the car up, isn't it, for the combination of that particular circuit and its characteristics. And so the more that you have at your disposal in terms of those items, be it rear wing or beam wing, you're going to give yourself more opportunity to set the car up aerodynamically at the given circuit. I mean, whilst we're here, I will talk about the rear wing that they had available, let's say, at Brazil. So Again, lost a bit, I think, because of everything that went on in Brazil. I think you could write a book on its own about what happened in that one particular race. But sprint qualifying, sprint race, McLaren ran their new rear wing for Brazil, which was somewhere between their medium and their low downforce. Sorry, their medium and their high downforce rear wing. It's sort of an in-between spec. An interesting design in its own right because it's more V-shaped than we've been used to in this particular era, the way that teams have designed spoon-shaped rear wings. However, when they knew the weather was changing for the race, qualifying and the race, they decided to go with a higher downforce setup because they knew that obviously this wing was more tailored to conditions conducive to having that lower downforce, but also the DRS capability that rear wing offered. In the wet, you're not going to get that DRS capability. And so they opted to change that and obviously have a car that was more compliant for the conditions. So again, another interesting scenario because none of the other teams really headed in that direction. And so that makes McLaren stand out a little bit.
Okay, so let me just understand this from my layperson's point of view. That the wing we saw in the sprint race was essentially a preview, let's say, of the fully legal wing they promised to bring in Las Vegas. Possibly.
Possibly. I do think they will have a lower downforce rear wing for Vegas than that particular specification, but it is plausible that they will use it there, and we may even see it in Qatar as well. It just depends because everything's really thrown out of whack for me in terms of where people are with downforce levels, and the reason I say that is what happened in Mexico.
So now you're going to have to explain that before I go back and clarify the question that I had, because I don't think I asked it quite correctly. Go ahead. What happened in Mexico?
Okay, so historically in Mexico, we've seen the teams run at the highest downforce configurations. Monaco, Hungary, Singapore levels of wing, let's say. The
altitude, you got to run smack as much downforce as you can because of I'm going to say it for the bingo at home, air density.
Correct. And you don't get penalised because obviously the rarefied air means that you don't get the same amount of drag for the amount of downforce that you're running. However, this year, the top four teams, we all know who they are without me saying them, had less than the high downforce specs on the car. They were running less downforce than their highest downforce configurations. And I think that was precipitated by one team starting that and everybody having to jump ship because they suddenly realised we're going to have to sacrifice what we've got in the corners because they're going to be rapid down the straights because they can run less downforce.
Well, come on, tell us the team. It's public information now.
Well, I'm not sure who did actually precipitate that. However, what I will tell you is that one team ran two options. So they split their drivers. Any guesses?
Red Bull.
Correct. So we have Perez on the highest of downforce settings, and we have Max on something slightly less to be able to chase his rivals. But obviously more concerned about tyre wear at that point then as well, I would imagine, because you're going to stress the tyres more, having to use more mechanical grip through corners or more aero load through corners that you haven't necessarily got. So again, a setup choice, but this has completely put me off foot as to how the teams are running, because suddenly we've got a situation that doesn't tend to happen. You don't have teams not running full downforce at that particular circuit, which also then means that they're not running the downforce level you would anticipate them at other venues as well. In Brazil, for example, where the wing that McLaren run looked to be out of kilter, the one that they ran in the sprint race, because it looked like it was too low a downforce for that particular circuit, because remember, that's at altitude as well. So I see going forward, we're in a situation where the floor is creating a lot more downforce than perhaps we all considered it was, and suddenly it now means that we can trim the cars back massively. And then that puts the other teams that are trying to catch up at a massive disadvantage because they're not creating that downforce from the floor, and they're having to run higher downforce rear wings, front wings to be able to get what they need from the car, and we get a disparity. So end of a regulation set, I know it doesn't make too much of a difference, but I'm interested to see where we go with this in 25.
Well, I'm absolutely loving it. And my immediate question was going to be, and you sort of already got there, is that for the people running barn doors, they're missing a trick on the floor, because that's clear. That's where that has to be coming from, right? There's no other way to generate. You either put a barn door up top or you make it underneath the car, which was the intent of this regulation all along.
Yeah, I mean, in fairness, the rear wing, front wing are trimmers. They're based around getting the right specification for a circuit and the circuit characteristics, the corner characteristics. Your main downforce will always come from the underfloor, whether it's this regulation set or not. But it's just very interesting to me that we're in a situation where we might be running less downforce from those trimmed elements than perhaps we've been in the past, purely because we're making so much downforce from the car itself.
So what I want to ask now is a more complex question, and because we're talking about the underneath of the floor, so you sort of have your splitter, your T-tray, and then you have all these tunnels, most of which exit out to the side, but the two of which carry on all the way back to where the diffuser is. And then you have the diffuser itself. So my question is, have you been able to tell, are they making variations in the diffuser or where these other tunnels exit out at the side that might be related to the different, seeing unusual or unanticipated levels of downforce on top of the car?
Well, I think it comes back to what was expected from this regulation set is not what we've ended up with in terms of the sheer amount of performance that these cars are capable of. I think we're back into a situation where the regulations looked to have produced a poorer representation of performance and the car originally, but the teams have outdeveloped that by having problems with things like bouncing and porpoising in the beginning, and have suddenly found the route to resolve those problems. And we end up in a situation where things aren't designed in the way that they were anticipated. So the way in which, the floor geometry, the underfloor geometry works, perhaps is a little bit different to what people think was going to be with this particular regulation set. And as you say, a lot of what goes on at the front end of the floor is to do with wake. It's to do with pushing wake out the side of the floor so that you get a premium airflow to the centerline tunnel, and that delivers to the diffuser. Obviously there's a huge amount of mechanism going on under there. You've got a lot of vorticity going on under there, and also externally. And obviously the wake profile of these cars has increased exponentially beyond, again, what I think was originally thought would happen with this regulation set. And I think that's where the big line of performance is coming from, is that the teams just understand these regulations to a point where they're gaining a lot more performance than was originally intended.
Well, they're always going to do that. I didn't name me a regulation set where they haven't outdeveloped any projection the FIA or FOM have ever come up with. But I want to get back to my initial question, which, you said this is probably not the wing they're going to run in Vegas. But what I was thinking was it was a wing developed with the characteristics that are going to be the next family of their we're not bending the corners up on the DRS element, like you identified very well earlier in the season.
Yeah, I think the biggest problem that you have there, though, is, again, you're butting up against cost cap restrictions and resource restrictions in terms of what more are you expecting to see before the end of the season, and how much does that have an impact on your development schedule for 2025. And I think that actually brings me to an interesting point about the way that McLaren developed their car, in as much as that if you look at under this particular set of regulations, so let's go back to the start of these regulations, how they have actually used the development trajectories very different to everybody else. So they tend to start with a more benign beige car at the start of the season that they know is going to get them where they need it to be, but they've already got something else sitting in the wings that is going to come in as a big development down the line, very much like they did it this year with the Miami update. And then they heavily develop towards the middle to end of the season, but because they've done that, they've taken some development away from what would be the first part of the season, whereas other teams might do things very differently in terms of that schedule. So I think that might be advantageous in some ways to the fact that we've seen McLaren make big leaps this season, like they did last season. But obviously it's big because it looks different to how the other teams are doing it as well. You know, they don't develop in the same way, and so you get this sort of stagnated development path from all the different teams, and that's where the track, you know, it looks different when you look at the results.
Yeah, so from a marketer's point of view, I'm saying you're going to get more splash for your development cash by having this sort of offset development cycle. But I do wonder, I mean, this is a weird thing. I do wonder, because everybody gets to go racing, they get the same amount of track time. But do you think it's also a development advantage that they run 3, 4, 5 races with a fairly basic mid car and get a lot of data on that as they're preparing to bring sort of like their initially designed car? Like I remember when this initially happened, they basically said, oh, we feel like we missed our production deadline by about a week and a half when we had this revelation. And rather than spend extra money, we thought, oh, let's just delay it until after the start of the season. Now, you could argue from a points point of view, they lost so many points between the start of the season in Miami, having a fairly uncompetitive car, that you know, if I'm Lando, I'm thinking, you know, geez, if I had the Miami car in Saudi Arabia, say, maybe this is a different season for me. But I think in terms of making the team look fantastic, it's an absolute win.
Yeah, but then that goes back to the fact of, if you wanted a better car at the start of the season, you have to sacrifice the tail end of the previous season. And this is always the crux of it. You've only got so much resource, you've only got so much budget to work with, and you've got to try and find a way that gives you the better car over the course of an entirety of a season. And let's not forget that at the start of a season, we've got pre-season testing, and the teams arrive for pre-season testing and say, we've missed something here, and the tyres operate in a different way to perhaps how we thought they might. And now we have already got all of this development already en route to the car for 2-3 races down the line, and it might not be any good. Whereas McLaren have, hold your horses, let's get to testing, let's see how the car reacts, let's delay the development a little bit, let's work on it, but let's not get it into the production. And then they move their targets a bit further down the line, or at least that's how it comes across. Obviously, we're talking about it in a very basic way, but that is the way that I perceive development at McLaren operates on a different level to some of the other teams.
Well, I am personally here for the offset development cycle because it's made the season incredibly exciting. And I realize that in my long list of things that have been cheated on, we have only made it to 2 so far. But I do want to move on because we've talked a lot about McLaren and their development and their reaction to this. And just the curiosity of so many different rear wing families. I think it's going to be interesting to watch. Do you predict for them then? I'm just going to put the question to you now before we move on. Do you think then, looking at them, they are going to continue to evolve fundamentally the car that they have? Because it seems like they have much more margin for improvement than any other team. They clearly are onto something. So do you think they're going to continue to evolve this design and use their offset development in the essentially the last season, as far as we know right now, of this regulation set? Or do you think they're coming to the end of it and they're going to need to come up with something new and different for next season?
I think that they will continue to evolve what they have in front of them. It just makes makes sense. You know, we've seen Red Bull this year try to make a huge step so that they had an advantage going into this year and the following year, which would have allowed them to back off in terms of development for 25 to give them breathing room for 26. And unfortunately for them, it's a little bit blown up in their face because McLaren have obviously exceeded expectations. And to be honest, Ferrari and Mercedes have also made leaps forward in terms of where they are from a pecking order point of view, even if they haven't made the giant leap that McLaren have in terms of being able to take Red Bull to a fight every single race. So I do think it will be a case of evolution, especially as we'll be going into the last year of a regulation set. You know, there's no point realistically throwing all of your toys at next year's car when you know that you've got to sacrifice some of next year's development for 2026 to get a head start there as well. So 25, this is the problem when you have regulation changes. You always have a year at the end that looks exciting on track, but from a technical standpoint, you're sort of in a lull because you've got a lot of evolution and you're sort of waiting for the next set of regulations.
Okay, let's move on to everybody's second favorite team, or maybe first favorite team this season, Red Bull, the only other real competitor for the championship, and certainly leading the Drivers' Championship. They had their own mini cheating scandal, two of them, in fact. But let's start with the most recent one, which is the magical ride height adjust. No, really, I'm just adjusting the driver's pedals for comfort in Parc Fermé. What on earth was that about? And what do you make of it in terms of, do you think it was really happening or not?
Okay, so what we're really talking about here is not a ride height adjuster. We're talking about the bib being adjusted. So the bib is the section that's underneath the chassis, ahead of the floor, and has the plank attached to it. Now, it does obviously have a bearing in terms of ride height because that is the first point of contact if you were running rake to be into contact with the floor, and then you get into the whole realms of being disqualified for having the floor damaged because you've hit it too much, a la what happened to Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc last year in Austin, let's say. However, although there's a bit of a storm regarding this whole thing, I'm not sure that this was ever something that was a cheat mechanism. I'm sure it was something that was being used, but I think it was something that was being used to adjust setup between runs in free practice in order that you could do it quicker than you could do if you had to dismantle the entire assembly and go about your business that way. This particular adjuster would simply move the bib height in order that you can move the setup around on the car and find something that's more appropriate for the given conditions. And given how Red Bull have struggled with their curb riding issue at the start of the season, something that seems that they've sort of got over now, that they're not as bad as they were, I think this was more about that. It was more about finding a easier way of getting the car set up for the race during free practice sessions. We'll never know if they were actually using it mischievously, let's say, but it could have been. But I think it would have been very difficult to use in the way that people assume it was, because of the way that you have to move a lot of things around in the pedal box to get to the actual adjustment. So I think, again, it's one of those, we've had a lot of what I would call tit for tat. You're telling on me to the head teacher, so I'm going to tell on you, and let's see who gets expelled first. That seems to be the general run of things this season, as we've already talked about, because it's easier to try and get your competitor to lose some of that advantage than it is for you to gain some advantage.
Yeah, well, it seems like they were not going to lose very much because all they did was stick a piece of tape over it so they couldn't adjust it in Parc Fermé. So it's not like that has gone away. But I'm going to ask you now the same question I asked for McLaren. As far as if I'm Red Bull, like you said, they said we felt like we were coming to the end of our capacity to improve the previous generation. We're going to make a revolutionary new car that will give us more margin for development and allow us to continue to stay ahead of our competitors, which has not happened. are they going to stick with what they have now, considering next season is the last season of regulations? And this to me seems harder because on the one hand, you would really not want to have to redesign the car again, because that's a lot of resource. But if you look at the progress of this season, if they stick with this car, I mean, they're going to have to come up with an awfully big Band-Aid to keep up with Ferrari and McLaren at the very least, and on occasion Mercedes when the car works for reasons they still can't entirely explain.
Yeah, so I think that we will probably see a interim version of the RB20 from Red Bull next season, in as much as that they won't change everything. I think they'll have learned what they've learned from this year, and they'll have applied it to what they already know, and they will come up with something that's somewhere in between the two. However, because of 26, because of the rule change, that will be weighing on their mind as well in terms of how much development you throw at next year's car, and do you simply sacrifice next year to win 26? This is always the thing of a regulation change, and it's why I'm saying earlier that they're very interesting from a on-track point of view, but from a technical standpoint, because of the difference between two regulation sets and the ability to run two parallel development streams, whilst you've got a budget cap and whilst you've got resource restrictions, it's incredibly problematic. It's not like when we changed cars for 2009 and Honda spent £750 million on a car that then they sold to Braun for £1 and then gave them $100 million to run for the season. You know, we're not in that era anymore. We're in an era where you have to think about running two programs at once, and which one do you sacrifice, because you can't run both at full tilt. And I think that Red Bull will probably take the approach that if we know we can't catch these guys, we'll sacrifice next year in favour of 26.
I love it. So let's get back to the good stuff, which is, of course, the cheating. And they, having been accused of illegally manipulating the bib height in Parc Fermé, the other teams had good reason to come after them because they accused all the other teams of cheating by flexing the front of the car. So explain this to me a little bit, because we've been seeing these elements on the front wing flatten out. And it just seems like the FIA was like, okay, yeah, from a practical point of view, we're just going to let you do that and everyone can fully take advantage of it.
Yeah, so again, it's a situation that we've seen previously in Formula One. Formula One's technical aspects are usually just regurgitated versions of something we've seen before to suit the prevailing regulations. You know, we've seen rear wing flexing before, we've seen front wing flexing before, we've seen floor flexing before. We've seen all sorts of cheating go on in the past of Formula One. These are all things that we've seen on numerous occasions, and they will always continue to be part of the sport because they have an advantage that can be gained from them, and teams will take advantage of that. In this particular instance, what we're seeing is front wing flexing, but we're seeing it in different ways. We're not just seeing it in one linear direction, i.e. the flaps are flexing in a certain predetermined way. And the reason for that is all of the teams have got their own way of designing the components that go into the front wing. Most of what I see as the current type of front wing flexing comes down to how teams approach the attachment point between the flaps and the end plate, because then that allows them to have more flexibility in how the flap sort of declines from the amount of force that's on it and then reduces the drag. Red Bull obviously had their suspicions that people were taking the mickey in terms of how much that flex was happening, and decided that they needed something doing about it, or they were going to do the same themselves. And again, it falls back on, well, why didn't you just do it yourself? And the reason they didn't do it themselves is because they know that that would require time, money and resources to achieve, and it would take time to get it onto the car. If you can instantly have it removed from another competitor's car, you hobble them to the point that you might be quicker than them. There's also other mechanisms that are improved because the front wing is flexing. Let's be honest. You can run the car differently because you've got a different set of characteristics going on, and it also has a bearing on things like tyre performance and tyre longevity as well. So it's not just a one aspect scenario. It's how it sort of accumulates into creating a better car all round. And obviously the FIA have come out and said that these designs are okay. However, what they have also done is instructed teams to do what they've done with the rear wings. And now during free practice sessions, we have markers on the end plates and on the flaps, and there's a high resolution camera looking across at those in order that the FIA can study what's going on and have an appreciation of how to reframe the regulations going forward in order that we don't have some of these arguments in future regulations. However, we'll have all of this again in 2026 because the entire structure of the front wing will be changed, and all of that mechanism that they've learned will be redistributed to the way that these new wings are designed. But in reality, we're in a position whereby it's cheating, but it's not cheating, because the front wing flexes, but it passes the load deflection tests, and that's the crux of it.
So it seems like to me, just from things I've remembered you said that were a clever point of view, even if you could wave your magic wand and instantly produce a wing that flex, like say, I believe Aston was one of the complaints, it doesn't matter because you've designed the entire back of your car to work with a different set of airflow characteristics. So even if you could have that front wing, it's not necessarily going to benefit you, but contra that, it will absolutely hobble your opponent because now they're going to have to redesign the entire car going backwards for the new flow of air through their now restricted wing. But I'm going to ask for your comment. It sounds like to me, if I'm the FIA, there's no way to define a limit of aero elasticity easily. And so when I tell the teams to put dots on it, I'm essentially saying that is the line where it is right now. If you push it farther than that, we will find a way to come after you. Would that be a fair reading of that?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I've mentioned this in articles in the past. For me, what they did with the rear wing became a self-policing idea to prevent teams from doing stupid things with the rear wing in terms of tilting the entire structure backwards, because they no longer could, because they were being monitored. Yes, obviously we've had mini DRS since then, but that is a different mechanism entirely as to how that worked. And as you say, the thing is the line is now in the sand in terms of front wing, because the FIA now have the metric to understand what is going on. And if you then start pushing beyond that, there'll be question marks. Well, how is this more flexible, and why is it more flexible? And how do we prohibit that going forward? At the end of the day, the biggest problem from the FIA standpoint is that air elasticity is and always will happen, because you can't make a wing that is infinitely rigid, because as soon as you apply force to it, it will break. And so, if you keep increasing the load tests, all you're doing is making it more and more difficult for them to be passed, and you're making it so that the teams then just push the boundaries that little bit more of aero elasticity to find a gain. So I think we're at the point where, like with the rear wing, a self-policing aspect will probably be the way that the FIA are looking at it and hoping that it prevents the teams from trying to push things too far.
Okay, and now this brings me to my favorite and the last of this season's cheating accusations, or at least that we are aware of, because there may have been some that we never heard about, to be fair, because of how the FIA works. And that is asymmetric braking. And the accusation here, if I'm remembering it correctly, was this wound up being attached to Red Bull, that they were finding a way to brake the inside front wheel in slow corners to aid rotation. And the idea of that, I'll just save you the paragraph, goes back to the original McLaren fiddle brake, which was an actual second brake pedal that literally did just break that one wheel when the driver wanted to use it, in conjunction usually with the throttle. So you could get on throttle earlier and keep the car rotating without destroying your tires and developing a huge amount of understeer. But this came out of one of your colleagues' fanciful drawings and created the biggest stir I think I've seen all season in the technical space.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't believe that this is something that was actually occurring to the point that it's basically been written into the 2026 regulations is the reason why that this came about. So essentially, I believe, I understand that this was brought up because of the power unit manufacturer discussions about the issues that were being faced by the sheer issue that the power unit for 2026 wasn't providing enough power compared to what was being anticipated, and that's why we've ended up with a set of aero regulations that has to deal with those problems. And I believe that this was one of those discussions. Can we do this? Because then we won't have so much of a problem with the power unit regulations. We can offset it. However, from a safety point of view, I think the FIA decided that this was something that needed to be addressed immediately. And so it was written into the 2026 that it was prohibited. And because they realised that, hang on a minute, this question has now come up for 2026, let's just cover it off because we're already rewriting a draft of the 2024 regulations. Let's cover this off and apply it to the 2024 regulations. And nobody really caught on to the fact that it had been put in 26 first and applied to 2024 afterwards. So I think that's where that story emerged from, more of a case that it wasn't realistically going on right now, but it might be something potentially that could be applied in the future.
What I love about it is just how much consternation it created at Red Bull. But by the same token, and I'm going to ask you about this, by the same token, they appeared to have a fairly big drop in performance right around the time that this story happened. Was that in conjunction with an update that they brought? And if not, is it reasonable to think that they might have been up to something else that they did have to make allowance for that we just never heard about?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest issue I think that Red Bull had, and I touched on this earlier, in the early phases of the season, and they hadn't really been caught out by it because the other teams hadn't really been doing such prior to that, was the curb riding issue. So a lot of teams were doing very similar to Red Bull in the past, whereby they would try to stay off the curbs as much as possible because it has potential to damage the car, and it also has some other unintended consequences with tyres and all that sort of stuff. However, this season we've seen a lot of the other teams have more compliance in that respect, and drivers starting to attack curbs, whereas Red Bull couldn't do that. And I think that is some of where the potential loss happened at the start of the season. As you mentioned, they've also had very mixed bag in terms of what has worked and hasn't worked on the car from an upgrade standpoint. And they actually even reverted the car at one point. I can't remember which free practice session it was, but they reverted back to China spec. And it's like 10 races ago. So they were seriously interested in what had gone on between that point in the season and their current point in the season. And if you've got to go that far back into your development trajectory, you've got some serious issues with something that's gone on in terms of your understanding of how the car works. Now, we've already talked about how powerful the floor is, and we've also not touched on how many times teams have had to change and go back specs on floors this season. So Ferrari, Mercedes, Aston Martin most recently have basically taken new floors to Grand Prix, run them for one, maybe two Grand Prix, and gone, this isn't working, we need to go back, and have ended up going back in specification. I mean, Aston Martin did that in Mexico, I think it was, and went back to Suzuka's floor because they just couldn't get it to work. It wasn't providing what they wanted at the right height. It was oversensitive, didn't produce the right downforce, and also didn't interact well with the other components. And so all these things that gel together, it's not just it's so one-dimensional. You know, it's so easy to think about things from a very simplistic point of view, but there's so much going on in terms of how these things connect with one another. And so I think that's perhaps where Red Bull have suffered from their development point of view is that they've made a big mistake at some point. They haven't realised it, and they've continued to develop on top of that and work themselves right into a corner. And I think overriding that, perhaps Max was able to drive around those problems to a certain extent, and Checo unfortunately wasn't, and that's where perhaps their overlapping differences in performance comes about as well.
So is it just a pure coincidence that every team you named for me having to go backwards on floor specification is also not the team with the newest wind tunnel on the grid, which would be McLaren?
It might have something to do with it, hadn't it? I mean, if you look at the problems that a certain two teams that have the same power unit have that run in the same wind tunnel.
You mean Aston and Mercedes, don't you?
I do. You might suggest that they have had similar problems, and 2 normally equals 2 plus 2 equals 6. So somewhere along the lines, those two teams are obviously having similar problems because of their tools and the availability of the tools to them. And let's not forget that Ferrari have just refurbished their wind tunnel and have suddenly started to see some gains because perhaps their tools are now more up to date with the current set of regulations and what you need to achieve under these regulations. And Red Bull have openly admitted, they've got a pre-war wind tunnel. And yes, it's clearly had updates throughout time to deal with, what they're actually doing with it. But it is an old building and they are potentially looking to upgrade. So I think the tools themselves do have a massive impact on what we're seeing, and also scale. I think everybody forgets that, we don't just put a full-size car in the tunnel. It's 60% scale model. It does things differently on the tunnel than it does in real life.
Yeah, and so this is what I love about my theory, is that the new wind tunnel has tools that are better able to parse where they were losing, I'll just call it resolution for lack of a better word, where they were losing resolution between the car, the model car, and the floor, and just even having a new rolling road that is maybe designed to better spec and more accurate, or a better material, could potentially unlock a huge amount of performance for a team. But you bring up Ferrari, and I'm kind of glad you did, because there was a race, it was a one that Sainz won. I was like, well, no, they didn't actually bring any updates. But I think what I should have said, and you can correct me, is they didn't bring any declared updates. So where is Ferrari right now? And what is the difference between updates and declared updates? And I do want to take credit for calling it updates and not upgrades at this point.
Very well done, because few people do that. They're still calling them upgrades. And as I've mentioned many times in the past, you cannot call it an upgrade if it doesn't work. In terms of what is an update and what isn't, I think where we're missing some information here is that everybody just attributes the car presentation document as being 100% foolproof and accurate. And it is far from that. It is an indicative piece of paperwork for the media to understand at a base level what has been changed on the car. It is not a checklist of components that has been altered from one race to the next. The teams won't tell the media everything. There's stuff that's changing that aren't on those documents at all. At the end of the day, they're only aerodynamic surfaces that are listed in those documents. They don't have to they don't have to tell anybody about the mechanical components that have been changed. So let's say they change the suspension arm position. That's not listed because they're still using the same aerodynamic fairing. So there's a huge amount of in-between stuff that people like myself have understanding of and have knowledge of that aren't actually on those documents. That document is only realistically any good as a feeder, as an introductory feeder into what has been changed, and not necessarily what has actually been changed on the car. It only gives you so much information anyway. I mean, let's just take a beam wing for example. McLaren had listed 3 beam wings as introduced at Silverstone: high downforce, medium downforce, and low downforce. Which of those 3 did they run on the car? We don't know. We don't know which ones they were, because they don't have to tell us that. and they might not have run or they might not have run any of them. They only have to say that they've bought new ones. They might have run an old one on there, and you don't see those beam wings go into the pool until further into the season. So just because it's on a document doesn't mean anything in reality. Part of my chase is always understanding what is actually on the car. Is it new? Has it been introduced at a previous race and never raced? And, you know, all of the grey area that lies in between in terms of what touches mechanical and aerodynamic.
This, by the way, is why you should always read his articles. And where can we read those articles, Mr. Summers?
Motorsport.com and Autosports.
And Matthew Somerfield is who you are looking for.
Indeed.
That is excellent. So tell me a little bit more about Ferrari here, as I realize I forgot to look at that thing called a clock when we started our show. So my time management skills may not have been the best here. Tell me real quick, since I've asked you the same question now about Red Bull and McLaren, and I think we're going to do Ferrari and Mercedes real quick here. Where is Ferrari in terms of their development? And do you see them making a big switch for next season? I mean, looking at their performance, I'm thinking they seem to be doing pretty good with what they have. So I would be surprised, but you have a better insight than me. So what's going on there?
Yeah, again, I think we're talking about evolution going forward into next season. In terms of their overall design, they have changed some of the design characteristics, let's say the side pods, the floor, to what we would say are items that we see elsewhere on the grid. So where they might have had a design that was more Ferrari, they've sort of switched their tact and moved in another direction. Like the side pod inlet, for argument's sake, that got changed at some point in the season. I think it was around the Spanish Grand Prix off the top of my head. But again, yeah, they're sort of in that area where they're making they're not making huge strides in terms of looking for their own design direction. They are looking at what everybody else is doing, applying it to themselves, and then trying to optimize their package around that and optimize those designs to improve them going forward. Which is, it's an interesting way, because if you remember back to when Ron Dennis said, well, we can't win with a Mercedes engine because you'll never beat Mercedes. Well, you'll never beat your opposition if you completely copy them. But if you start to think about those designs and then finding the optimizations that exist around them, then you can beat those opposition, as has been proved by McLaren, for argument's sake. Their car was very much like a Red Bull copy at one point, and then evolved into something that was very much their own design. And so I think that's the sort of direction that we're finding Ferrari in. But again, Ferrari with their own power unit have to work around their own constraints in regards to that, in terms of heat rejection. They do things differently in terms of the way they do their cooling. So an interesting team, obviously, Ferrari, because of the way that they operate with their own power unit. But from a design aerodynamic point of view, it's more of a case of we'll follow the leader and then work outwards from there. They tend to start a season with their own intentions and then sort of fall towards something else to get the performance.
All right. And then this brings us to Mercedes, which I think have to have been the most perplexing team on the grid for me, because they showed flashes of they have arrived at the sharp end, and then they would show up to the next race and just be nowhere. Are they stuck? Are they still stuck with a less than perfect base to develop from this season? Is my only real question.
I think the thing with Mercedes is that they are still a little bit out of kilter in terms of their development because of the direction they took with the zero pod. So obviously their first two cars under this regulation set had the zero pod. They had a whole world of problems with that and the way that it interacted with the floor, perhaps not understanding how much the floor was going to play a role in creating the level of downforce that was required of this particular regulation set. And now they're very much in a different position from the side pod perspective, because they obviously switched, and they've sort of gone it their own with that design a little bit. but they are sort of feeding off of other people, a bit like Ferrari. We're seeing design aspects that are on other cars, but they do have a lot of design of their own, front wing wise, for argument's sake. A lot of that, as other teams have followed them in that direction. So they've obviously got very good ideas, but it's just not all joined up into one package. And I think one of their biggest issues has been understanding the floor mechanism and the bouncing issue. That is where they predominantly have problems, is with bouncing and having the right ride height. When they seem to get in the window, then they're right, because they can get the car to operate correctly at the right ride height, and they can get the tyres to work. As soon as they get remotely away from the window, that's where they begin to struggle, and they just can't find the performance. So it's a bit of a Goldilocks situation going on. Their porridge is a bit overdone by the sounds of it, and they just need to get a bit cooler on the porridge. Okay,
then that is about what I expected. So we can anticipate seeing a similar trajectory to Ferrari's then with regards to the next season entry?
Yeah, I think so. And obviously a team like Mercedes already know that they have essentially done worse during this regulation set than they anticipated, and perhaps they will throw more eggs in the 2026 basket, knowing that there's more advantage to be gained from losing some ground in 25 but gaining massively for 26.
Okay, so we've sort of been talking about the future anyway. I want to take this last little bit of the show and sort of preview the 26 regulations. And I have a couple of questions for you. The first and foremost of which, are you excited about the new aero regulations? Because once again, you can say that's not a barge board, Ted.
Well, they're not barge boards, no. But I'm sure they'll get called it, won't they, at the end of the day? That's one thing that I always love about this sort of thing. Things get called things, and it's like, no, that's not what they're called. They're not eyebrows over the wheels. They're wheel deflectors. They're not barge boards. They're this, that, or the other. Nomenclature to me is quite an important thing, because it defines areas of the car and how those things interact with one another. But it seems to get lost elsewhere. In terms of 26, I'm still a little bit perplexed as to the direction we're taking, because we are being dictated to by power unit manufacturers and the direction that's gone on there. I still think there was other directions that could have been taken to improve matters, and I do think that we will have a lesser product from a racing point of view because of the factors involved. But obviously there are some changes that have been made to try to mitigate some of those now. So hopefully they'll work and improve things going into 26.
And my second question, because we're talking about the broader, because right now their plan is to do both the aero regulations and the power unit regulations in the same season, which, I have my own thoughts on that, and mostly they are why. But given how good the racing has been this season, and given the number of finicky redraws we've had so far, how reasonable is it to anticipate that this really does happen in 26 versus maybe one or both sets being kicked back another season?
Okay, so they have to happen together. That's a simple fact of the matter, because the aero regulations are written to deal with the problems that arise from the power unit regulations. So unless we're completely rewriting the power unit regulations, which then we potentially lose Audi and Ford and everything else that, the OEMs that have committed to come in for 26, I don't see us having a different set of aero regulations. Yes, they can be adjusted, but they're the way they are to suit the power unit regulations. I will say that every single regulation set that I've known since 2009 have come a year late for various reasons. So 09 was supposed to be 08, 14 was supposed to be 13, 17 was not really a massive shift, so I don't classify that, and neither was 19, but 21 was obviously was supposed to be the regulation change, and we didn't have it for obvious reasons as well. So we've always had a shift back by a year, but I'm not sure it'll happen this time. I think they're committed to it. I think that they've worked hard to frame the regulations in a way that the power unit and aero work together in conjunction, and like I say, they can't be implemented separately. If you put that power unit in a car from this year, we'd only be having sprint races because you wouldn't be making it to the end of the race based on how things work with those power units. So we have to have them together. Hopefully we get it pushed back a year, because then we'll have better racing, because that always happens when this happens. But I don't think that will. I think we'll get them in 26.
All right, then I only have one more multi-part question for you, which is, first of all, will you come back sooner and talk to us once again? And second of all, where can people find you on the socials?
Of course, I'm going to come back. Time. That's the biggest enemy of everybody, isn't it? And getting to sit down. Always enjoy these discussions, Matt. So thanks for having me along. And if you want to find me on the socials, I am still on Twitter, because that's what it's called in my book, and it is Summers F1.
Excellent. And as for me, I'm Matt PT55 on any particular social network you care to search for me, except for Facebook, where I'm at Trumpets. And remember, until next time, this has been Missed Apex Podcast.